And I thank the Speaker, and I thank the gentleman from Texas for yielding. And I also want to thank the gentleman from Delaware, Mr. Carney, and the gentleman also from Texas, Mr. Conaway, and the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Scott, who all along with us were able to work together in a bipartisan manner on this legislation. So I want to begin my comments then today by clearing up what might be called a knee-jerk reaction that some commentators have made about our efforts on this legislation. See, today's legislation are not about deregulating the swap markets or creating loopholes for market participants. In fact, this bill is just the opposite of that. See, there is broad bipartisan, I'll say it again, bipartisan support for appropriately regulating the swap markets and shining the proverbial light of day, if you will, on what was once an opaque marketplace. And I agree that bringing greater additional transparency and clarity to this market is a positive thing for all, for American consumers and taxpayers as well. But I have significant concerns about how the ongoing Dodd-Frank implementation of this appropriate regulation is being conducted. See, only in Washington, D.C. would you have two, not one, but two regulatory bodies tasked to work together to implement rules required by Congress, and then have them working down two separate, entirely different tracks on rules that will impact literally hundreds of American businesses and thousands of investors. See, what you have is one agency over here, it's moving forward with a 100-page informal guidance. And the other, on the other hand, has just released a 1,000-page formal rule proposal. One proposes applies U.S. regulations to transactions taking place entirely outside the U.S. between U.S. non-persons, and the other creates a new detailed substitute compliance framework. So it's hard to imagine a scenario in which these two proposals are more different. In effect, we have two very powerful U.S. regulators. Both of them have literally hundreds upon hundreds of millions of dollars in budget and thousands of staff. But at the end of the day, they cannot sit down together and work out a common proposal. That's not what Dodd-Frank wanted them to do. They wanted them to come together, and that's what this legislation would effectuate. H.R. 1256, the Swaps Jurisdictionary Certainty Act, will restore that much-needed sanity to the rule writing of this extraterritorial application of U.S. swaps regulation. Again, given that there has been some confusion and a great deal of mischaracterization by some commentators on the impact of this legislation, let me take a moment to make certain everyone understands exactly what it does and the effects it will have. See, the legislation before us allows the CFTC and the SEC to continue to enjoy significant discretion and also flexibility as to how they implement the rules. We are not removing any of their current authority. In fact, we're adding to it and we're enhancing it. First and foremost, the legislation specifically requires the SEC and the CFTC to have the same or identical cross-border rules. You know, I think it's difficult, maybe it's impossible, for anyone to suggest that it is appropriate for two domestic U.S. regulatory bodies to have two different standards governing very similar parts of the market. So by simply requiring the agencies to get together and have identical rules, the bill will limit the ability for potential arbitrage opportunities for the market participants, and it will ensure that we have a standard, identical regulatory regimes for both types of swaps. See, there is a great deal of ongoing discussion right now about how to limit this, how to limit regulatory arbitrage opportunities for market participants. Under this new regime, the most glaring area of potential in this area is if the SEC and the CFTC has different rules. Secondly, the legislation requires a formal rule, not a guidance, but a formal rule to be issued. Currently, the CFTC is moving down the path of instituting a amorphous guidance, if you will, which really has questionable legal authority. So without a formal rule in place that carries the force of law, there is a valid concern that some entities won't feel the need to even abide by this guidance from the CFTC, or that, if it's challenged by court, might carry considerably less weight. So by requiring a formal rule, the bill will then ensure that the force of law will apply without question. And finally, the legislation specifically authorizes the SEC and CFTC to regulate swap transactions between U.S. and foreign entities. Now, this is important. If the regulators are concerned about the importance of the importation of systemic risk, why is this important? Because under current law, it is really questionable what authority these agencies actually have to regulate potential transactions between U.S. and foreign participants. We add this to it and give them that explicit authority. So if the regulators are concerned about any foreign country not living up to the Obama administration's G20 commitments, that was established back in 2009, then these regulators will be able to work together to specifically authorize under the Act. This expansion and enhancement, if you will, of the regulators' current authority, I would think, it should be, well received by the administration. If I can have just about another 45 seconds. Great.
Gentleman is recognized.
And finally, in a formal statement of administrative policy, the administration argues that the bill will somehow slow down the implementation of Title VII. This can't be further from the truth. By requiring the agencies to work together and put the same rule, this will remove legal obstacles here in Washington and ensure that we have the appropriate regulatory framework, and sooner rather than later. It will remind the people saying that we will somehow slow down implementation of these rules. No, that cannot be further from the truth. Dodd-Frank was passed almost 3 years ago, and we're no closer today than we were 3 years ago to getting this done. Mr. Speaker, let us restore then some common sense and some clarity to the rulemaking process and actually some additional transparency. Let us not play into the narrative that the rest of the country has a dysfunctional Washington. Let us make sure that our financial regulators are actually working together and not instead trying to allow some to front-end each other. And let us pass this legislation. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman's time.